this journey to get closer to God in every aspect.
You must know something. I do believe that Jesus is most likely the Messiah.
Jonathan Roumie had carried the weight of playing Jesus for years. Every scene demanded more than acting. It was prayer. It was surrender. And yet, nothing could have prepared him or anyone else for what unfolded during the filming of the Passover scene in The Chosen. The cameras were rolling. The table was set. The cast had gathered around for what was supposed to be one of the most sacred moments of the entire season. Everyone knew the emotional weight of the Last Supper. But as they sat in silence, something else entered the room. It wasn't in the script, it wasn't planned, and it would leave every single person on set stunned. From the very beginning of production, there had been a sense that this season carried a different kind of weight. The storyline was moving closer to the crucifixion, and the air behind the scenes often felt heavier than any dialogue spoken in front of the cameras. Jonathan had spent days preparing for this moment, long hours of prayer, private sessions with his spiritual director, hours reflecting on the meaning of the Eucharist. He wasn't approaching this like an actor delivering lines. He was stepping into sacred ground, but none of that could have predicted what was about to happen. As Jonathan sat at the table, surrounded by his castmates, something shifted. It wasn't exhaustion, it wasn't nerves, it was something far deeper. The energy in the room thickened. Crew members grew quiet. The lights seemed softer. The atmosphere felt like it was holding its breath. And then, without warning, Jonathan Roumie collapsed. The cast froze. Crew members rushed forward. The set fell into an eerie silence as everyone tried to understand what they had just witnessed. Was it physical strain, a spiritual encounter, or something neither science nor script could fully explain? What happened next would leave not only the cast, but the entire production crew questioning what they had just experienced. And it would become one of the most talked about moments ever captured behind the scenes of The Chosen. For Jonathan Roumie, portraying Jesus had never been a simple acting job. From the first day he accepted the role, he understood the weight he was stepping into. It wasn't just memorizing lines or hitting his marks on camera. This was different. This was sacred. Long before filming began for Season 5, Jonathan entered into a period of deep spiritual preparation. He spent hours in prayer, not simply asking for the strength to act, but for the grace to carry the character in a way that honored its significance. His spiritual director walked with him through the process, offering counsel, intercession, and guidance as he prepared to embody Jesus during some of the most intense moments ever filmed in the series. This wasn't a casual routine of quiet reflection between shoots. This was full immersion. Jonathan studied the scriptures, meditated on Christ's suffering, and reflected on the meaning of the Eucharist. The Last Supper wasn't just another dramatic sequence to perform, it was the foundation of the new covenant. It was the very moment where Jesus offered himself, body and blood, as the sacrificial lamb. For Catholics like Jonathan, this moment carried even deeper significance. The Eucharist wasn't symbolic, it was real. It was the heart of the faith, the point where heaven touches earth. The Last Supper initiated what would become the Church's most sacred act of worship. And now, he was being asked to step into that moment, to carry its weight, to feel its sorrow, and to reflect its immeasurable love. Every rehearsal became an act of devotion. Every script reading turned into a prayer. The responsibility didn't lessen as the days moved closer to filming. In fact, the burden only grew heavier. This scene wasn't about performance. It was about entering into sacred ground, and Jonathan knew that if he approached it lightly, he would be missing the gravity of what God had done in that moment of history. The crew could feel it too. The entire set seemed different as they prepared for the Last Supper sequence. There was a reverence that settled over the production. Even crew members who didn't share the faith sensed that this was not like any other filming day. The Last Supper was the threshold. Behind this table of bread and wine lay betrayal, suffering, and death. But within it also existed mercy, salvation, and eternal hope. Jonathan wasn't just stepping into a role, he was stepping into the shadow of the cross. The day of filming arrived. The Passover scene had been circled on the shooting schedule for weeks. The cast gathered early. The crew made their final adjustments. The table was prepared down to the smallest detail: unleavened bread, wine, the bitter herbs, the ceremonial cups. But even with all the planning, nothing could have prepared them for the atmosphere that would settle over the set that day. As cameras rolled, the cast slipped into their roles. But something quickly shifted. The usual hum of production, the background chatter, the technical calls, the rustling of equipment faded. A deep stillness filled the space, as though an invisible weight had dropped over everyone in the room. Jonathan sat at the center of the table, his eyes lowered in prayer, fully immersed. This was not acting. Every breath he took seemed deliberate. Every glance toward his disciples was heavy with meaning. Around him, the other actors felt it too. A few wiped away tears that had come unbidden. Their lines hung in the air longer than rehearsed, not out of hesitation, but out of reverence. The crew stood frozen behind their monitors. Even seasoned professionals, hardened by countless productions, sensed that this moment was unlike anything they had witnessed before. They whispered among themselves between takes, speaking in hushed voices as though raising their tone would violate something holy that had entered the room. Dallas Jenkins, watching from behind the monitor, found himself unable to speak. His finger hovered over the button to call "cut," but he couldn't press it. There was nothing in the scene that needed correction. What was unfolding before him wasn't directed. It was simply happening. Tears ran freely among the cast. The silence between their words grew deeper. No one told them to cry. No one instructed them to slow their delivery. It was as if the weight of the moment was pressing on each person individually, but also binding them together in a collective experience, neither rehearsed nor planned. The air grew heavy with unspoken understanding. The Last Supper wasn't being acted out, it was being lived. And as the sequence continued, that sacred tension only grew stronger. What no one knew was that the most extraordinary moment was still to come. In the days leading up to filming, the cast had taken part in something far beyond a typical rehearsal. Rabbi Jason had been brought in to lead them through a full Passover seder. It wasn't for the cameras, it wasn't for publicity, it was for their hearts. If they were going to sit at that table and portray this moment with any integrity, they had to understand it not just as actors, but as human beings stepping into history. They sat together, shoulder to shoulder, not in costume, but as themselves. No lights, no cameras, just the table, the meal, and the weight of tradition stretching back thousands of years. Rabbi Jason moved them carefully through each step. He explained the significance behind every element on the table: the bitter herbs representing slavery and sorrow, the matzo symbolizing affliction and haste, the wine poured in remembrance of deliverance. Every movement was deliberate, every word spoken with care. As they progressed through the meal, the connections between the ancient rituals and what they were about to portray on screen became startlingly vivid. The blood on the doorposts of the Israelites that spared them from death, the lamb sacrificed for salvation, the meal eaten in anticipation of freedom. It all pointed directly to the moment they were preparing to film, the moment when Jesus would lift the bread and declare, "This is my body given for you." The weight of it wasn't academic. It wasn't an interesting historical fact to jot down and forget. It pressed in on them, seeping into their hearts. For many of the cast members, even those who had grown up in Christian homes, this was the first time the link between the Passover and the Last Supper truly came alive. It wasn't just ancient Jewish tradition. It was a living thread that ran from Moses to Jesus, from Egypt to Calvary. As they listened, something shifted inside them. This was no longer about pretending to be disciples sitting at a table. They were stepping into the shadow of a real covenant being offered. It was as if they were standing at the crossroads of history, watching God's plan unfold in front of them. By the end of the seder, few words were spoken. The cast sat in silence, absorbing the depth of what they had just experienced. And as filming day approached, they carried that weight with them onto the set. But no one could have anticipated how that weight would break open in the hours to come. The Passover scene was only one part of the long, grueling days the cast endured that week. Filming stretched late into the night, sometimes into the early hours of the morning. The lights stayed hot. The cameras kept rolling. The emotional weight of each scene settled heavier with every take. What had started as a dramatic retelling was becoming something else entirely. For Jonathan, every word Jesus spoke was a burden. Every glance at his disciples carried the ache of what was to come. The sorrow that filled the Last Supper scene didn't evaporate when the cameras stopped. It followed him off set, clinging to him in the quiet moments between takes. Elizabeth Tabish, who portrayed Mary Magdalene, felt it too. Her scenes that week had pushed her beyond anything she expected. At one point, she admitted to being physically dehydrated from crying so much. It wasn't simply acting, it was entering into grief so real, so raw, that her body reacted as if it were her own suffering. Noah James, playing Andrew, described moments when the emotion blindsided him. The lines were familiar. The blocking had been rehearsed, but something unexpected would rise up in the middle of a scene. A wave of grief or awe that he hadn't planned for, pulling him deeper than he thought possible. He didn't have to force the tears. They came because the weight was real. George Harrison Xanthis, playing John, found himself overcome by the sheer vulnerability of it all. He later confessed that there were moments when he looked across the table at Jonathan, fully immersed in the role of Jesus, and could barely hold himself together. The history they were portraying wasn't ancient and distant. It was alive, pressing on them in ways they hadn't anticipated. The crew, though mostly hidden behind cameras and monitors, felt it too. Some quietly stepped away between takes, needing space to compose themselves. Others stood in stunned silence, their eyes red, unable to explain why the room felt so charged. This wasn't just another production. It was something heavier. And as the week wore on, the exhaustion piled up. Not just physical fatigue from long shooting days, but a deeper exhaustion, a kind of soul fatigue that comes from living inside grief, day after day. They were walking through the final days of Jesus' life, scene by scene, word by word. And though they knew it was a script, their hearts weren't letting them off easy. But none of them yet understood that the most unexpected moment was still building quietly beneath the surface. As the days unfolded, something subtle but undeniable began to happen. The distance between acting and real spiritual experience grew thinner. For Jonathan Roumie, The preparation he had done before filming wasn't something he could leave at the studio gate each day. The prayers he whispered in private began to echo through his scenes. The meditations he carried in his heart bled into every glance, every breath, every line. He wasn't simply playing Jesus anymore. He was living inside the weight of Jesus's final days. When he rehearsed his lines at night, it wasn't just memorization. It became a kind of devotion. The scriptures weren't scripts. They were prayers. Each word carried the echoes of ancient promises. The Gospels moved from the page into his bloodstream. And as filming pressed deeper into the final chapters of Jesus' earthly ministry, Jonathan found himself surrendering more completely with each scene. There was no clear line separating the man from the role. The emotions weren't rehearsed. The tears weren't planned. The heaviness that settled over him during the Last Supper scene wasn't something he could conjure on demand. It came because his heart was breaking along with the story he was telling. Other cast members noticed it too. Between takes, they often found Jonathan sitting quietly, eyes closed, hands resting in prayer. Sometimes they joined him. Sometimes they simply gave him space, sensing that what he was carrying was far beyond any acting exercise. The set became more than a workplace. It became a kind of sanctuary. The spiritual intensity followed him home each night. The weight didn't lift when the cameras shut off. Long after the day's scenes wrapped, Jonathan would sit in the stillness of his room, trying to process what he was experiencing. The grief of Jesus, the love in his eyes, the pain in his voice. It all hovered with him, like a cloud that refused to move. This wasn't method acting. It wasn't a performance technique. It was something far more personal. The role had become a kind of pilgrimage, one that demanded more than professional skill. It required surrender. And as the days led closer to the collapse, it became clear to everyone around him that Jonathan wasn't just portraying the Son of God. In ways no one could fully articulate, he was encountering him. Away from the set, the weight followed him in a different way. The more the chosen spread around the world, the more Jonathan Roumie's face became inseparable from the character he portrayed. For millions of viewers, he wasn't just Jonathan. He was Jesus. At fan events, premieres, and meet and greets, people approached him trembling. Some broke down in tears before they could even speak. Many reached out to embrace him, as though they were embracing Christ himself. They weren't seeing an actor. They were seeing something sacred. And as moving as those moments were, they carried a strange and heavy burden. Jonathan never wanted to blur those lines. He never pretended to be anything more than a man playing a role. Yet he understood why the encounters were so intense. For some, the chosen had reignited a long-dormant faith. For others, it had offered comfort in seasons of deep loss. More than once, strangers had approached him to share stories of forgiveness, healing, or hope that had unfolded while watching the show. Some told him it was the last thing they shared with a dying loved one. Others said it led them back to church after years of absence. In those moments, Jonathan often found himself standing silently, listening. What could he say? How could any words capture the gravity of what people were pouring out before him? He offered hugs. He whispered prayers, but mostly he just stood there and let them speak. The danger, though, was always lingering beneath the surface. The risk that people might confuse him, the man, with the one he represented. Jonathan carried that awareness carefully. He spoke openly about his own imperfections, his weaknesses, his very human struggles. He reminded people that he was not the source of the power they felt. He was only a vessel, Over time, he developed a quiet rhythm to protect his heart. More prayer, more grounding, more reminders to himself that the role was sacred, but he was still a man. The real Jesus didn't need Jonathan to be perfect. He simply needed him to point upward. And while the crowds continued to grow and the stories continued to pour in, Jonathan's humility anchored him. He knew the greatest danger wasn't the weight of the role. It was the temptation to forget who the real savior was. But as season 5 pressed on, the pressure was building in ways even he didn't fully see coming. As the season unfolded, the cast of The Chosen became more than co-workers. The long days of filming, the emotional weight of the scenes, and the sacred nature of the story they were telling forged something much deeper. They became a kind of spiritual family. Between takes, there were moments of laughter, shared meals, and small conversations. But often, there was silence. Not an awkward silence, but one filled with quiet understanding. After heavy scenes, especially those involving the Last Supper, the cast would sit together, heads lowered, simply absorbing what they had just walked through. No one felt the need to fill the silence. They had all felt the same invisible weight settle over them. Prayer became a natural part of their rhythm. Sometimes a group of them would gather quietly before a scene, holding hands, asking for strength. Other times, they would pray for each other after a difficult shoot, offering comfort for the emotions still clinging to their hearts. The set wasn't a church service, but the reverence was unmistakable. Elizabeth Tabish often spoke of how these quiet moments of support became her anchor. She leaned on the prayers of her castmates as the emotional toll of portraying Mary Magdalene grew heavier. Noah James, too, found strength in their unspoken bond. The scenes might call for grief and fear, but off-camera, he knew he was surrounded by people who understood exactly what he was feeling. George Harrison Xanthus played a steady role among them, often reminding the group to stay grounded even as the show's success brought more attention. He understood the rare gift they had been given, and he took that responsibility seriously. Jonathan, at the center of it all, carried a unique burden. The others knew what he was walking through, and though they couldn't fully step into his shoes, they stood close enough to feel the edges of his struggle. At times, they would simply sit beside him, offering quiet presence without words. It was enough. This fellowship extended beyond the cameras. Group texts, late-night check-ins, and shared moments of vulnerability bound them together. They weren't just portraying followers of Jesus. In many ways, they were learning to walk alongside him together. But even in that closeness, none of them fully realized that the heaviest moment of the season was still waiting just around the corner. As filming progressed, the shadow of what was coming grew longer with every scene. The closer they moved toward the events of the Crucifixion, the more the atmosphere on set shifted. Even in scenes that weren't directly connected to Jesus' death, there was a quiet awareness that everything was moving toward the cross. The cast could feel it. Every word Jesus spoke to his disciples carried a new weight. Every parable seemed drenched in a deeper sorrow. Every quiet moment between the characters was thick with what was left unsaid. The anticipation of the crucifixion hung over the entire season like an approaching storm. Jonathan often found himself sinking under the gravity of these moments. It wasn't something he could rehearse. No amount of preparation could fully brace him for the emotions that would rise up as they filmed Jesus speaking words that in the story would be some of his last. The lines weren't difficult to remember, but they were nearly impossible to deliver without breaking. The same was true for the rest of the cast. Scenes that should have been familiar suddenly felt impossible to perform. In one quiet conversation between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, Elizabeth Tabish found herself overwhelmed before the first take even began. It wasn't scripted emotion. It was something pressing into her chest, something unspoken but undeniable. For Noah James, the scenes between Andrew and Jesus carried a weight that went far beyond dialogue. The friendship between their characters had grown over multiple seasons, and now every glance between them was laced with the knowledge that this story was racing toward loss. Even for the crew, the tone was different. There was a hushed reverence as they set up each shot. Crew members who had worked on dozens of films whispered to each other about how strange the air felt, how the silence seemed heavier than usual, how the emotions pouring out of the cast didn't feel like acting. Dallas Jenkins, watching from behind the monitors, could see it happening. The cast wasn't just performing. They were breaking under the weight of the story, and there was nothing he could do to prepare them for what was still to come. Because while these moments were deeply emotional, the crucifixion scenes still waited ahead, and everyone on set knew that what they were walking through now was only the beginning. Looking back on it all, Jonathan Roumie could see the pattern unfolding in ways he never anticipated. The timing of everything, the filming schedule, the emotional collapse, even his outside commitments, all seemed to line up with a kind of precision that felt impossible to explain. Months earlier, long before filming began, he had agreed to speak at the National Eucharistic Congress. It was scheduled nearly a year in advance, something far on the horizon that barely registered at the time. But as filming progressed, as Season 5 dug deeper into the Last Supper and the approaching crucifixion, and that speaking engagement loomed closer on his calendar. At first, he worried. The schedule was tight. The scenes were heavy. Walking away from set, even for a few days, felt disruptive, even risky. But as the filming days grew longer and the emotional toll deepened, something unexpected settled into his heart. The overlap wasn't an accident. It was providence. He was spending his days immersed in the filming of Jesus breaking bread, offering the cup, establishing the new covenant. And then, immediately after, he would be standing before thousands at the Eucharistic Congress, speaking about that very sacrifice, that very covenant, as it lives on today. The line between his work on set and his life off set had blurred in ways that no production schedule could have designed. It felt like divine orchestration. Even the Vatican visit that followed seemed part of the same invisible thread. Standing in Matera, Italy, filming the crucifixion scenes that would soon define Season 6, and then days later, walking the halls of the Vatican, delivering a gift to Pope Leo XIV. The timing was too perfect to dismiss. The weight of what they were filming carried into every room they entered. Jonathan couldn't escape the sense that they were part of something far larger than a television series. The spiritual preparation, the emotional breaking points, the collapse on set, the encounters with fans, the perfectly aligned schedules, all of it felt like it had been stitched together by a hand far greater than theirs. And as he sat quietly, reflecting on everything they had captured, he knew this much for certain. They hadn't simply filmed the Last Supper. They had lived through a miracle. What happened on that set can't be reduced to great acting. It wasn't just a well-crafted script or a talented cast or months of preparation. Those things were all there. But something else moved through that room. Something no camera could fully capture. As viewers watch the Passover scene unfold on screen, many will feel it too. That strange heaviness behind the words, the silent pauses that linger just a little too long, the raw emotion that seems to crack through the performances. They'll see tears falling where none were written. they'll sense the stillness that settled over the room. And they may wonder, as those present on set have wondered, if something sacred interrupted the production that day. Was this simply the emotional toll of telling the greatest story ever told? Or was it something deeper? Something that transcended the lights, the cameras, the script? Jonathan Roumie's collapse wasn't planned. The tears that followed weren't directed. The silence that swept across the cast and crew wasn't written into the shooting schedule. And yet, they all felt it. Even those who don't share the faith recognized that they had stepped into something beyond the boundaries of television production. The question lingers: is this more than acting? For many who have watched The Chosen, the answer is obvious. For others, it remains a mystery worth wrestling with. But whether you call it divine presence, spiritual breakthrough, or simply the undeniable weight of the story itself, one thing is certain: what happened during the filming of that Passover scene left a mark on everyone who witnessed it. And now, it leaves a question for you. What do you believe happened on that set? Was it a moment of emotional exhaustion, or was it a glimpse of something sacred breaking through? Could this be a reminder that God still moves, even in the most unexpected places? Share your thoughts below. Subscribe for more behind-the-scenes stories. And stay tuned, because what's coming in Season 6 may take this journey into even deeper, uncharted territory.